I'm Rick from Carthage Classic Cars. On this video, we're back on the 70 RT Challenger. As you can see, a lot has changed since the last video that was put out on this car. We're gonna go back through and I'm gonna show you a lot of the process on how we got to this point, and then we're gonna take the car one step further. At the end of the video, we're gonna try to get the car into this phase that this Challenger's in with the slick sand and everything else. I'm going to show you on this video why there's some epoxy in just this area, why this area has been slick sand. The car's already been gapped out, adjusted, the whole front end's been off the car, and you can see it's on the rotisserie. Like I said, we're going to take this video in more of a two parts. The first part is going to be the metal working phase and how to gap the car and finish it off once your parts have been on there. And then the second part of the video is going to be the start of the body work. We're modifying the process a little bit since this car, because not that anything's wrong with it, but this car, there's a couple things since we did with the gapping, which we did follow that, are just a little bit different, and I think we can improve on it. So we're always trying to improve on the process of efficiency, what materials we use, and everything else. So looking at the car with the rotisserie, the key to the rotisserie is to balance out the car. As you can see right here, both this Challenger and this Challenger over here, the rotisseries are set about the same. That would be the center balance point of the car. So I'd say when you put a car on a rotisserie, we have videos on showing you how we've done this before, and I didn't do it on this video, that's why I'm gonna just explain it, is I would start with the center point of the car a little bit higher. You see there's adjustments here. And actually, we actually had to modify this frame jig because I wanted my mounts coming in straight so I can get my grill in and everything else, but we had to keep raising the rotisserie on the center point of the car. And then the idea is when you spin it, it shouldn't spin with a lot of resistance. And you see the car actually holds where you leave it. So that means the car is balanced. You can see there's still some sand coming out of it. When you blast these cars, this frame rail is one of the only things that was factory left on the car. You remember everything was removed. So that's what I was saying. If you blast these cars, expect the first couple times you're gonna, actually probably a little bit after that, you're gonna see sand and everything come out. I haven't done anything on the bottom of the car since the frame jig's been removed. So also on this video, what we're gonna end up doing, we're gonna sit there and it's a little bit unbalanced because the wheels are off the car. I wanted it a little bit lower, but you see, I mean, it's just rocking on the center post. It's not gonna go anywhere. But you can see when we cut off the frame jig, these areas, we still have our mounting points on here where the K-member was. So we'll clean up some of these areas now that we can access the bottom of this car. So we're gonna do that on this video. I'm not really gonna show it, but on the second part of the video, I'll show you, we're gonna come back and we're gonna address some of the bodywork stuff. So let's get to what we've already done on this car to get it to this point, and then we'll come back and I'll show you the bodywork portion. So we're going back in time a little bit and we're gonna pick up where we left off on the last video on this Challenger, and all the metal work was complete, the car was together, and now the car needs gapping. So the first step that I do in any gapping phase, first I take it in a process where we're going to address each corner separately and independently. Now saying that, the doors are together and everything on the last video was adjusted as close as possible. You could see right there I took the straight edge and I was just making sure everything is about as close profiling, so that's in and out on the Challenger, as we can get. Now, you don't want to be cutting the door gaps or grinding like I am right now if your profile's not right, because that's going to change the gap if you're yanking the edges in or out. So the process is really simple. We're going to kind of just roll through this really quick. You saw kind of what I was doing there. On the back one, I decided this gap had to be opened up quite a bit. And we went over that in the last video, and I showed the highlights on what happened with this. I mean, there's nothing that really happened that bad, but these parts are just not exactly perfect. So for us to adjust it out of the door, we would have had the front end being crooked or anything. So you could see right there, once I do the profiling of the car, I'm using the straight edge, and on that one there is a slight curvature, so I'm just looking at the curve versus holding it straight into the car. So it's just got to flow right. It doesn't have to be exactly straight. We just don't want anything sticking out. So what I'll do, I cleaned up the edges. I'm taking my gapping tool, that's what that green thing is, and I started at the peak of the door pretty much. That was the worst part about the car. And I'm taking a cutoff disc, running down the door. You can see this bottom area is a little bit straighter, so I can use a straight edge there. And we're just opening that quarter panel. To me, it's easier to open the quarter panel than go back and weld on the door. So the quarter panel, and how when I opened the door, it felt like, I think the issue is actually in the quarter panel, because this quarter panel, it seems a little bit long here. Like when you look in that door jamb, it looks like it's pushed forward a little bit. So no big deal. I just take the cutoff wheel and I slice right down. I'm doing a little bit at a time. We don't want the quarter panel walking up and down. Like if we cut the whole quarter panel top to bottom, well, lining up those body seams and body edges will be a lot harder. So if you could take 2-3 inches at a time, take your screwdriver, come in there and just tap it in, then just tack those areas. Now you saw in the last one, everything here, external body, I weld with the TIG welder. I am using the MIG welder to tack things up just because it's easier with one person. It doesn't give you as much flexibility to sit there and work out any kind of issues, but I'm putting so little bit of heat into it, I'm not super worried about that. So for me, it's easier to just tack up with the MIG welder and then come back with our CK20 water-cooled TIG torch, and I'm about 45 amps, and we just run up this thing really quick. And then that's going to take the MIG weld wire that we actually added, and it will melt it and fuse it. So it'll be like a TIG weld in the end. It kind of just blends it all together. You can't see your MIG wire patches, so that just acts as a normal filler wire, which actually, this TIG rod I'm using, the ER7050 I believe it is the same thing as the mild steel MIG wire. You could see with this TIG welder, you really want a constant run. I'm stopping every now and then to get more comfortable. I'm using a trigger switch on this, but all in all, I think the job came out really good. We'll just clean it up a little bit with a belt sander, and just, I'd want to make sure I don't want to dig down too deep. This isn't a MIG weld. We don't have to take off a ton of metal. You could see the final product on the gapping. I think it came out pretty good on this edge, and then the profile looking down this whole side of the car looks really good. And that's what we're really striving after, because the closer we can get this, the less filler we have to add down the road as far as Rage Ultra or anything else high build. So just dialing in the gap with the grinder, that's the last step in this process. So we're going to address the trunk. I went over that same issue, that the trunk was just sticking out a little too far. It's going to be the same process in the sense that we're going to use the MIG welder to tack up our rod. This is the same thing. So if I have to add filler to any area, like a filler metal, I'll actually take, you know, some TIG rod. Usually I'm going to take the 1/8 inch rod, not the 16th. It gives me a little bit more meat on it, and I'm just tacking to the edge. I pulled the trunk off, and I'm going to get in a comfortable spot where I can just TIG weld right here on the ground where I'm hunched over and I'm more comfortable. The more comfortable you are in a TIG weld, any weld really, the better off the weld's going to be. And then the metal's got to be clean. There's other factors, but being comfortable is another good recommendation for when you start welding. On this weld, I'm trying my best to control the heat. You can see I keep going back and I'm feeling the panel because I know it is stretching a little bit. That's just the byproduct of welding, that no matter what heat input you put into it, to get the proper penetration, you are going to warp the metal a little bit. It's going to expand back out when it heats up and then shrink when it cools. So we know that there was a couple spots on this trunk that were just slightly high and they started to want an oil can. So what we're going to do, we're going to take a heat shrinking disc. So this big disc right here, it's stainless steel, and we're just holding it on the highs. It wants to stay on the highs because it's a flat metal disc. Now, this would be like taking a grinding wheel or a flat disc and putting heat to it, but you're not removing metal. You're actually just kind of, all the molecules are coming together where the heat is, causing it to rise. And the same thing that happened with the welder. Once those highs, they'll rise up more. It looks worse initially, but then I give it about 30 seconds when I turn off the disc, and then I get the cold water, and then we're going to shrink it back down. That's going to relieve everything, and it kind of takes the highs out of everything. So that's something to look into. This disc has saved me many times, and it is really helpful once you understand how to do it. We put more metal on this corner jamb, because we use the 1/8 inch filler rod, the TIG rod, and then we ended up just grinding it down to the right level. Looking at it with heat shrinking it and everything else, the trunk gap is pretty much dialed right in there. So I also worked on this corner edge a little bit. I did the quarter panel. So I added the filler rod to the trunk, and then I actually took the quarter panel and pie cut that open a little bit, and also did that. That really helped going on both sides, that you're not adding too much, and the car just doesn't look out of place when you open the trunk, or like this fender door. You just want to think about it. You don't want to open something and be missing your whole door seam that's folded over, because everyone will know that edge was worked. So this is the same as the other side. I'm taking the slide hammer, I'm pulling out the fender and door. Usually everything curves in, especially like door skins. When I have installed them, I try to hammer them down as best I can, but they'll actually have to be a lot of times slide hammered back out. It's very rare you actually see panels that are too far out, but after I slide hammer them out, then I'll hammer them in. What we're going to do then, once we do that, you see I just, on this door edge, it just needs some fine tuning with the grinding, the surface prep disc. So I have 80 grit on there. I just ground it down, TIG welded it back up, and then cleaned up my weld. I just welded up the gap. So you can see right here, this area also had to be opened up just a little bit. It was just a little bit tight around that edge. So what I ended up doing was just marked my edges from my gapping tool. I took the grinder and just ground right down. This is the same thing I did on the front that I was just telling you about. So I'll take my TIG welder and just run the new edge down. If I had to do more adjustment than what I initially done, I would have did what I did with the trunk and just did a little bit more adjustment on the quarter panel too, because taking away the metal looks a little awkward there. But we took so little, and once we welded it up, you can't even see, even when you're looking for it. So this edge on both sides didn't line up with the quarter panels and the doors, and there's not too much you can do to it because the body seam in the middle lines up. Our option right here would be best to just cut it back down and just curve it right into the edge of the door. Not a big deal. Same process. We're just going to tack MIG weld it, hold it up there, and then TIG weld the thing. And you can see now that it's grinded out, everything looks good. I like to take a file and a long straight edge file and just file down the edges. A lot of times with the pneumatic tools, you can't get a good, sharp, crisp edge. So taking a file to a lot of this stuff and just make sure you go the right direction in a file and you don't dull it out really cleans everything up when you start welding on these door jambs and everything else. And then same thing on the quarter edges. A file will also work there. Now that everything on the car is completely gapped out, we actually had to blow the whole front end apart again. So this is the part of the restoration world that gets just tedious at times. So we want to make sure everything's done. We welded on the inside a lot of these edges on these fenders and everything. So this process really shouldn't be done till after you're done welding, because everything we're going to do on the inside with this, with stripping it down to bare metal, prepping it, and then epoxy priming it, is really going to just be wasted, because you're going to have to come back in and spot prime the areas that you welded on or you cut on. So realistically, the car's gapped, and this is a good process to just make sure your car goes back together without any issues, instead of doing it in the paint phase. It would be a whole lot more stressful trying to get these fenders back together for the first time when they're painted, done, and everything's trimmed out and you can't scratch it, and then realize you need a strap to pull down here. So this is the test phase that if we can get these back together now and not have any major issues, okay, we can move on to the next step. So you can see I hand sanded all the flat areas that, go into the outside that we would warp with the sandblaster. What I'm doing with this little pop blaster right here, I'm going around to all the edges, grooves, crevices. I couldn't get the sanding tools in, and I'm just trimming it out, getting everything down to bare metal. This is going to match the rest of the car. Don't forget, if you go back to the very first video on the car, you know, the second video on the car. So after the intro video, we gutted this car down to nothing, and then we sandblasted everything on this car. So really, everything on this car has been sandblasted, stripped down to bare metal, everything that we can physically get to that aren't overlapping panels, and then epoxy sealed up. This car is about as well built as far as weather, rusting, from stopping it to rust again, as I feel you can do. And that was the goal from the start. So you can see we did the inner structure of the hood. Again, in the center, I only hand stripped the hood. That would warp it. So do not blast the hood, the trunk, just the inner structure. And that's what's nice about that, using that little pop blaster with a small nozzle. I could run down those supports and not even touch the hood skin. So that's something else that I like to do, is just kind of dial them in, because if you had to hand strip this hood, it would take hours and hours and hours. I mean, not saying that the blaster is that much easier, but it does save a little bit of time and makes a little bit more of a mess, and I feel like you get every single part of the part you're trying to blast. So you see at this point how we got to this aspect of the car, and you see everything that was bare metal and we stripped out in the gapping phase, we covered in epoxy primer. It's been sitting here for 3 or 4 days, so epoxy has completely cured. We can touch it. We're gonna have to scuff it to put filler on, and that's what I like to do. So the reason I took these areas out is because they're kind of roughed in. With this car and a gallon of epoxy, once it starts shrinking, now I have to come back with filler and work these edges. Well, then that's gonna kind of defeat the purpose of the slick sand, and I was gonna put another gallon on this thing, so we did 1 gallon beforehand. We're gonna body work it, and I'm gonna show a whole video on this car, and you could determine the difference between this car and maybe what's right for your projects. Each project, each car is slightly different. So with this car, like I said, it seems like we're kind of double working the slick sand and everything. On this car, I really think 2 gallons of slick sand is really what you're gonna need on one of these cars. So really, we wanna hit it hard one time, get it right, because spraying it's a pain in the butt. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna use our Evercoat Rage Ultra, and I'm gonna scuff, you're gonna see, we're gonna scuff these areas, and we're gonna do the rough body work. Everywhere I know on this car that it's gonna need some filler, we're gonna work it out and get it close, 95%. And then our lead channels, we're gonna use our Evercoat kitty hair. You can see they're still in bare metal. I'll show you, we're gonna strip them beforehand, and this is gonna go on there. We're gonna put a little bit of Rage on top to fill out any pinholes, as long as it doesn't touch bare metal. After that, once we're done with all the body work around the car, and we'll kind of show you some quick time lapse of this and how it goes about, we are going to use our 2 gallons of Evercoat slick sand. So this is going to be our super high build. How my gun's set up and everything, I found that 2 gallons on a car, on this car, it got really light on the hood. I don't know if you could see it. I don't think this one's locked up, but here, let me unlock it real quick. On this car, I'll just show you that when we put it on with the tip and everything, I don't know if you could see around the hood in the light, you could see where it gets a little bit lighter because we had to sacrifice a little bit on, you know, but the edges, I went real heavy everywhere we have to build out. So this should block out fine, but really there's a good chance that we're gonna have to come back through on this car just with these areas and blend it out again. So the idea with this car is we're gonna do everything one time and try to be more efficient with it. So we're gonna hit with the slick sand one time, 2 gallons on the car, let it shrink up for 2 weeks, and then it's good to go, and then we move on to the next step on this process. So, like I said, at the end of this video, this car should be in the slick sand. We should be waiting for it to shrink up, and a lot's gonna happen. I know a lot already happened, but a lot more is gonna happen on the bodywork, so stay tuned. We're now gonna try to push it along. Now you know the process with a small voiceover. Basic bodywork stuff. Look over my Bodywork 101 video series. That should cover any gaps in what I'm missing on the basics. So stay tuned. Let's get back to work on this car and get rolling with it. So I don't have any photos of it, but everywhere in the epoxy primer was stripped down with a Eastwood SCT 40 grit stripping drum right down the whole seam, top to bottom. Once that bare metal was done, that's when I did the bottom of the car. I went back through and I just covered it with epoxy primer, and some of the body work's been done above that, but we'll come back to that. I didn't get a good camera angle on it, so I just want to show the kitty hair first. As far as the kitty hair goes, this really is your first step in the body work process, filling the lead joints. I jumped around a little bit to make it more efficient with the owners, but you really want to strip out the lead joints of bare metal. Kitty hair is applied to bare metal with a scuffed 80 grit. It says in the TDS, just follow it. I've heard people saying it has a harder time sticking to epoxy primer and other paint surfaces. So we just follow what we're going to do. Now that that's drying, you can see we'll come back and dial in this bodywork area. So what I did, I applied filler to both sides of this car, almost like we were panel to panel gap in this car. Once we're done with that, I sit there and I'm blocking them out together. While I'm working both edges, if I break out in metal, you could see on the quarter panel there's a high spot right there. I'll stop blocking them both at the same time, open the door up, and then focus on just getting the edge straight and smooth out. This is going to keep the filler out of the area and just make it where it looks really good and it looks more natural. You know, the panel to panel cars are great. There is more filler, but they actually almost look unnatural, that you look down them and they are just laser straight. This car is going to be really close, but if you really get to it, you'll see the deviances in the door profile to the quarter panel a little bit, and we'll show some pictures on it. Now, the kitty hair has completely dried, cured, and what I'm doing right now, I'm taking this down with a DA sander. Do not hand sand the kitty hair. You'll be here all day. So this is the rough fiberglass work that we're doing, and there's going to be small pinholes in the long strand fiberglass. That's just part of the nature of the beast. So we're going to take our 40 grit and I come back in the 80 grit and kind of smooth it out, but I break it down really good with no backing pad and 40 grit. Same thing that we're doing up on this top channel. You see, I'll put usually 2 coats of the kitty hair. So I'll kind of pack it in heavy the first time, because you could see even in the lead channel, it wants to sink down in there. That's what you want. But so working this kitty hair, it's all tied together. So it's kind of hard to just, once you pull one side or smooth it out, it pulls the whole pile. So let your base get set up, sand it down, and then come back through with a second coat. So we're going to go over the actual bodywork process right now and how I did the back door. This has got a better angle at it and everything, and I can show the process of applying the filler a little bit better. So this area, we're just dialing in the really close 6 inches off the door edges where we strip down to bare metal. Everything else we're not doing. So what I've done right there, I've done it about the size of a spreader. So I've taped the edge off that I don't want to go past it. This front one I did a little bit. I'll come back through because I had some extra filler, and then just redial it in and just sand out those edges. But the idea is, once I started, I want to do the door edge first. So you see, I tape the edges up to make sure we don't get filler stuck between the fender and the door, and then I spread out the whole door. Now that the door has dried to the touch and I can apply tape to it, I'm now going to work on the fender. So the same process. Now we're going to tape the fender. Again, we didn't scuff this top area, so we just come back through, scuff it following the TDS of the Rage Ultra, tape it off so we don't go past our epoxy primer. And you can see this fender, I didn't work the very bottom. The door was sunken in a little bit, so I felt like adding filler to the fender was going to make the problem even worse. So I want to block the door edge first, and I can dial it in a little better once everything's done. These are small differences, but again, we're just going to cut the filler down that we don't have to. So now that the filler's dried, and with the filler, I try to start sanding this as soon as possible. It almost right after it clogs up the sandpaper. A lot of times in the beginning, I'll have to wipe off the sandpaper a little bit more. But I'm going to panel to panel block it like I told you in the other one. Take off all the metal. I'm actually going to see bare metal, knowing, and that's what I want, most of this filler's done. Then on all these edges. I already noticed in my head too. We're gonna open up our door edge gap. So where we sanded down our bare metal on our door and our fender, we're gonna open both sides up about 4 to 6 more inches, and I'm gonna apply a second round of filler. That's gonna get a bunch more imperfections and everything out of it, and then smooth out the transition. So we're stepping up the game. I feel like this is the best process on doing it without panel, filling the whole car front to rear with filler. So we're assuming the center of the door, everything on the slick sand, that's going to be able to block out. These edges are what we're really focused on, but we can't have a high transition from the door to the fender profile. So the idea right here is we'll work the edges first, get them dialed in together, then we'll come back through, open up the edges more. You'll see in a little bit epoxy, and then add our second round of bodywork on it. So this trunk, I said that, we're not blocking out the whole car, adding filler to it. You saw when we heat shrunk the trunk a little bit, and you can actually see now where the filler is. Those areas are a little bit low, which is good. But this looks like it's got a ton of filler on it. I lay this out with this metal spreader so thin. I took that whole little board right there, I spread that on the whole trunk area, and then I'm blocking down everything off the top of it, and I get it scuffed up first, and then I'm gonna go ahead and use guide coat. Now, saying that, the reason I'm doing this trunk, it's more original. It's an aftermarket part, but I think it's like 25 years old aftermarket. It had some damage on it, and then we heat shrunk it on top of that. So if you're working your car, you can sit there and actually work filler on one whole panel. If you have a door that's got a dent in it or some imperfections, or it's original and the rest of the car's aftermarket, just block out that door. Just do the body work completely on that door, so you know everything there is right before the slick sand. So I'm not saying that you could only do the door edges. Just block where you know the problems are in your car. And if you're doing the metal work on, or you spent enough time on your car, you should know where the major parts of the car are going to be. So what I've done the first round, we're using the blocks. We want a flat block. We want something to match the profile. And then we're blending. You see, I didn't put any filler on the center hump up on this Challenger. I taped those off. To me, that's where we're going to use more of the slick sand. So once it's blown off, and then we re-scuffed our areas, we got our guide coat out of our low spots, we'll go ahead and apply our second coat. Usually on this body work, you can get it done if you're pretty good at it. Usually I'll take 2 coats on everything. Usually the first coat is just get it on there, see where your highs and lows really are that you might not know about, and then the second coat we come back through. Again, it's applied really thin, and then we're going to just blend it out. Like I said, I scratch up the area. I'm going to apply the guide coat. It doesn't work as well unless you put a tooth on the filler. So you put the tooth on the filler, the guide coat actually goes in the scratches. And what I like about the guide coat more than everything else is the transition from the new filler to the old filler. That I need to make sure that guide coat's gone on that transition, or you're going to see a step up on the transition. So that's why I say the guide coat's even more important than, just finding the low spots. Because a lot of times with this guide coat, you could see where your filler is and you haven't sanded. But the transitions where, you have sand marks on your original filler and sand marks on your new filler, that's where the guide coat's crucial, because that has to go away. Or else when you put paint on this thing, something thin like epoxy, you'll see those right away. And the epoxy is just to seal out and keep everything a moisture barrier in between. It's just a good, hard, solid primer that does its job. So this is what I was talking about. We did our lead joints with our kitty hair. So now we're going to come back through and we're covering everything. I opened up those gaps more. Now we know in the kitty hair there's pinholes and everything. So we're going to just go do this one area. This is where I've determined that after our first round of rough body work that we want to go up to and just clean up and dial in a little bit. Now that the epoxy's dried, and this is going forward, this video is shot over a couple weeks before mounting it on the rotisserie and all that, saying that this epoxy, I usually let sit when I spray it. I don't like using the chemical adhesion. So this is sit over 3 days. I think it was about 3-4 days. It was done on a Friday, was shot with the epoxy, and then this is like a Tuesday or something coming back. So after the 3 days, we're going to go ahead and we're going to scuff up the epoxy, and then the same thing as before. We're going to lay on the filler. I didn't put the tape edge on. You see, we left a bare metal strip. I did that on purpose too. That bare metal strip is my guide. So when we come back, you'll see down the road, and we're going to strip this car. I know where I've already stripped to. So from a 1/2 inch on that tape line, all the E-coat has been removed up to the top of the other side of the epoxy. But like I said, it's the same thing as before. I'm doing one side, and then I'm coming back through, taping off that side, doing the other side. I apply it with the plastic spreader, and then realistically, the metal spreader, I think, gets it that much cleaner. So the cleaner you can get on there, the less work you have to do in sanding it off. You could see right here, this is also what I was talking about earlier, where I opened up where I'm working my filler a little bit wider. Also, a little trick right here, I'm using a hacksaw blade, a metal hacksaw blade, and now that the filler's on there really wet before we can use sandpaper, I'm just taking the hacksaw blade and cutting it down, almost like you would do with a razor blade knife. So that's something like the old cheese grater method, a hacksaw blade you can actually use a little better on these curvature areas. My opinion, the key to this filler is trying to sand as early as possible. That was the idea even with the hacksaw blade is. It was so early we can't even get sandpaper on it, but we could just get some of the major stuff off of it. I used to, going back 15 plus years ago, I learned the lesson the hard way. I put filler on half the side of the car, let it dry overnight, come back the next day, and you're out there all day. You can't really even shape it. Once it's this soft level and you can just work it, it comes off so fast, and then you can just shape it so much easier without struggling. What you don't want to be with this filler when you're blocking, we went over it in my bodywork 101 video. You don't want to be using tons of muscles and shaping this thing and pushing in metal. This is a slight touch thing. You're just gliding over it and let the sandpaper cut your filler. Well, it's going to do that a whole lot better when the filler's soft. Also, on your filler dry times with this Rage Ultra is determined how much hardener you put in it. So you could see some of my bodywork when we put on this car, my filler, my Rage is darker blue in color. Some of it's more that yellow. That determines how much hardeners used. And so I adjust that based on how fast I want it to dry. So as of right now, all the rough body work is finished. I also have the car rolled over because what I did, I cleaned up all these jig point mounts that we were talking about before, and then everything bare metal, once everything on the bottom is rough cleaned up, I kind of spotted in the epoxy. So right now, looking at this car, you could see from the previous videos, everything from on the bottom of the car, the inside of the car, and our front end pieces as far as this video are now sealed in epoxy. The only spots that, and we're still gonna come back, there's obviously deep pitted rust on these torque boxes and a couple of the original parts that are original on this car. So we're gonna come back and we'll fix those when we start doing underneath the car. We're not worried about it right now. It's protected, it's safe. You could see we got the rotisserie kind of balanced out a little better and supported. But what we ended up doing, we got about that much, 1.5 feet on the panels, front to rear, blocked out, and it's not panel to panel, but looking down this car you could see it's pretty close. Why we did the rough body work, like I said, I didn't want us to come back, add the slick sand and have to put filler over it. So how I do my body work, and you could see looking at all 4 parts of this car, walking around that, I put a lot of filler on, we epoxied an area, and I did straight lines, so I left a little bare metal on the outside of all these parts. What that's going to do, I know we're going to take this SCT, right now. The rest of this car is just in the E-coat. Now that we got the whole chassis, everything else protected in epoxy, we're now gonna fill in the rest of this area with epoxy, and we're gonna do the whole car. But since this area was stripped last night, you know, and we did the body work, of course, so spent all day on the body work doing the second round, getting it really close. So now I know from here to here, we don't wanna touch with the SCT. It's already bare metal spots breaking through. And I know a couple people are saying, well, obviously those are high spots. Yes, but they're so minor. I'd rather have a couple high spots poke through and then us seal it up, and then 2 gallons of slick sand. Then in the future, we won't break out in bare metal anymore. I'd rather do that than slap in a bunch of filler. And you saw on the video, I put a lot of filler on the car and I take a lot of filler off. To me, it just cuts down on the time it takes on this car. If we could take it off faster and level it out quicker and then show the bare metal, we know how much is on there, and it's not that much right here. It's very minimal. So it's within the tolerance of acceptability in just getting this stuff dialed in. And then now the product on this car, it just looks really good. Now it's not going to be perfect panel to panel. What I'm going to do, and you'll see in the future, once we get done with the slick sand, it hardens up. If we have an area that starts breaking out, we're going to stop, we're going to move to the other panel. We're just blocking, and that's what I did for the most part on these panels. To recap that, you know, I blocked across both of them and got them close, and a spot like this, once it showed up, I focused on this area and just getting that dialed in. So if you look down, it just barely sticks down. But when the car is rolled over, who's gonna be down here looking down that much? So same thing, we did our fiberglass work down here and up top. We epoxied over that, sealed over that in a larger area and blended it into this rocker. So what we ended up doing then, I put one more quick covering over this just to get the pinholes out of the fiberglass filler, because it has so many, like, fiberglass is just hard to stop the pinholes, you know. So, and the only reason, like I said, we're using this epoxy, the fiberglass, is the build and strength qualities. Fiberglass is a lot stronger and it has you can build thicker. It's waterproof, so we put it on the bare metal. So that's why we're using that first. The reason we're not using the slick sand is, as much as it builds, it's gonna be a lot more expensive, and we can't concentrate it like we can the Ultra Rage, you know. So this car right now has 1.5 gallons of Ultra on it, the body filler. Well, no it doesn't, it's on the floor, but we applied 1.5 gallons and then quickly cut it down, like I said. And then, so the 2 gallons of the slick sand, that should cover the whole rest of the car, and we'll show you that in the video. And then we should sand most of that down, but that's gonna be passed through the whole car, and that should just even everything out. So then we don't have to come back with the 2K, and then like this car, we don't have to come back with another gallon of the slick sand. So like I said, we're trying to just make things better, make it more efficient. There's a couple spots down here we got some filler on. We'll get to that. It's not a huge deal. We're gonna just DA sand the whole car after we do the stripping disc. So what we'll end up doing, we're gonna, like I said, strip down to bare metal everywhere where there's E-coat. So for instance, this rocker was sandblasted. The tail panel was sandblasted. You saw the trunk was already completely body worked, and then these areas up here were already done. So those areas, we'll just take the 220 on a DA and the backing pad, and we'll just go over them to make sure the epoxy sticks to it very lightly, you know, just to put a mechanical tooth. Once we get done stripping this, we'll be 80 grit according to the TDS of the epoxy, and we'll sand all that down. So like I said, let's get to it. Like I said, you see everything here in this car is pretty dialed in as far as the gaps. We did also finish the hood, so everything's closed up on hood. We got the hood latch in there, everything's adjusted there. The car, for the most part, is really good. Also, there was major pitting in these A-pillar areas, both sides. This was scuffed up, applied over the epoxy to filler, and I sanded it all down to bare metal, you know, just to make sure, again, we're not filling in and building. We don't want to build up the A-pillars, we want to be level. So That's going to be epoxied, and then we're going to slick sand that and then just final block that. So the same process goes through the whole car. I'm just showing you why we're doing this and everything else. So let's get to, like I said, the stripping disc. We might be using this one. This is a smaller pneumatic version of the 40 grit stripping drum. And on your project, like I said, the 40 grit is going to be the best thing to take the E-coat off. If you have some areas that are showing like slight pitted rust or anything, like you're working on your project, or an area has been sitting for a while, you might want to take the red Scotch-Brite drum. That will get in an area and actually polish it out a little bit more. Like I said, after both of these, this isn't like a 40 grit sandpaper. You'll have to come back with a DA. So let's get to work and let's get this car down to mostly bare metal minus the areas we already stripped in bodywork. Like I said, I already know I'm going to split the difference and come in about ½ an inch overlapping where we done, and then everything else is good. That's why we did it. We're just making a road map on the car, and we know where we've already stripped, and we're coming back and finishing it off. So let's get to the work, and when we get back, we'll get ready to slick sand this car, epoxy, tape it up, and we'll close this video out. We want to do it today and finish this whole job up, because once it's in bare metal, we're on the time clock. So let's get to it. So now all the grunt work begins. We're going to try to take this E-coat on this car front to rear, and once I start this process, I told you I don't like to leave these cars in bare metal even really overnight. So this is early in the morning, first thing we're starting the process, and it's going to be hopefully done and in our final stage of epoxy and the slick sand by the time we call it a night. So what I'm doing, I told you I got the 40 grit stripping drum. This is one of those things. It's easy work in the sense that you see I'm just going up and down. I'm just moving the wheel. Don't stop in one position. But if you do this wrong or you get too impatient, you can really damage some new panels, especially on this flat hood in front of the car and the roof I'm doing right now. The more curvature that these panels have, the stronger they are, the less you have to worry about doing damage. But like I said, this roof really only has one center bow in it and then the outside support. So realistically, you can't push too hard. With the heat, that's going to cause damage to this roof, and that's not at this stage what we don't want to do. I feel maybe one coat of slick sand, this roof is done. There's no imperfections. It was brand new. The good thing about this car too, I will say, the good thing is this is all brand new body panels. If you're doing this at home, this is not the stage to be first stripping down your car. You know, you're getting ready to put slick sand on, and then you find out the fender has already ½ an inch of Bondo. I know this car. I already know what's under every single panel because it's been sandblasted, stripped, or it's brand new metal. So all we're doing is removing a thin E-coat layer. If you're taking a project on in your shop and you don't know about it and you want to do the body work right, I think the first step on this car is stripping it down to bare metal on everything you're keeping, and then epoxy priming. Then, like I said, at this stage, you can just DA sand those areas and get it ready for the final coat of epoxy primer. You may be wondering why we put an epoxy primer now and we're just scuffing other areas, and why don't we put our slick sand right over our scuffed epoxy on the trunk? I want a uniform chemical reaction. That's what I'm going to use. I'm going to use this 2 coats of epoxy primer, one as our next barrier base. So when we're blocking down the slick sand in the future, if I see gray, we stop sanding from now on. We do not want to break out in bare metal anymore, knowing our metal's all really close. So we're going to use that as one, our guide, two, our chemical adhesion. So the idea then is the epoxy we'll use instead of that mechanical adhesion, which I'm doing right now from the bare metal to epoxy. We're using this DA. Now that it's in bare metal, we're using a mechanical adhesion in the form of a scratch, an 80 grit scratch. And so that's what is going to grip the epoxy. But then the epoxy, we're really not supposed to scuff it up for 3 days. It's in that chemical reaction window. So that's what we're going to do. So we're now have our mechanical reaction. We're going to go ahead, we're going to tape this whole car up top to bottom. We're going to tape all around it. I mean, yes, the car doesn't really have anything is going to be ruined, and then we got epoxy on the inside, and technically the whole inside of this car, underneath the car, the engine bay, all this could be covered in 2K and have to be hand sanded down anyway. But this is just taking it to the next step. We don't want to get that slick sand. It builds so thick, and you could just feel it when you spray it on the floor. Everything you're spraying filler, like you're literally spraying a type of what we would call Bondo, the brand Bondo, but a type of filler. So it's so thick and the feet stick to the floor. You just don't want that over everything. So the idea is we're going to tape up everywhere on the inner structure that we don't want the filler, the spray filler on it. So, and then when we pull it off, everything's more controlled, and it's just going to look so much better. So then when we come underneath this car and we go to scuff it up the first time, we're not worried about extra filler, extra polyester primer on there, all that stuff. So this is the best way I found to tape up cars. We're just going to you pre-plane your tape. We're not doing newspaper or anything else like that. We run our tape edges around everywhere we want to tape off. Then we're going to take our plastic sheeting, our painter's sheeting, throw it over the whole car. This has a paint one side and it's static cling, which makes it really nice. So this will static cling to the car. It makes it a little bit more challenging on the rotisserie. Usually if we're priming these cars, they're on the ground and we can throw that sheeting over it. But on the hindsight, priming on the rotisserie and painting on the rotisserie far exceeds a little bit of a hassle right here. So you see, now that we taped our certain areas, our window jams, everything else like that, we push our tape down in it, and you just take a razor blade and back cut the car. So you're cutting out the areas that you want to prime. It's weird because you're cutting out the window, but the window's staying on the tape line. So it takes a time or two to get used to that, and you'll probably mess it up, come back with tape and fix it. But once you do that, you could see we got the bottom just dangling. What we're also going to do, we need to tape the bottom under the car. Being that it's on the rotisserie, when we spin this car, we don't want that bottom blowing on the body panels when it's on the side, because we're taking full advantage of the rotisserie. So we are going to do that second. Right now, the main thing is to get the sheathing off the whole body and everywhere we're going to tape. You can see, same thing we did on the grill. We don't want any slick sand going in there, and we taped off the light area. So just a couple more cuts, we'll come back through, we'll get the main sheathing off. What I like to do too, a lot of times I'll take some tape, you can see right here, once I end up cutting the windows around, and I'll go back through and I'll put an extra edge of tape, just a hard edge. One, it stops any kind of imperfections I had on my razor blade and my cutting, and two, it really just holds everything tighter, and it really protects the edge. If you put a bunch of, the slick sand, unlike the epoxy, is a really heavy primer, so when it gets on these edges, it wants to cave in. So I just do that for a security sense, that I know my tape's not going to fail, because the worst thing that happens is halfway through the paint and a window or parts of your tape come off and you start spraying a certain area, because at that point it's too hard to start correcting. You just kind of go with the flow. I'm applying some wax and grease remover, but I'm not applying it anywhere I have filler. Wax and grease remover goes on bare metal and bare metal only. Filler is a sponge, so you don't want to put anything on there that might absorb into it. That's the same thing, and the reason why I also don't try to touch the filler unless I have gloves on. Just remember, filler's a sponge. Watch what you put on there. So now that we got our wax and grease remover on there, we're going to sit there and we are going to add two coats of epoxy MP170. We're following the TDS, and this is the same thing we've done on the whole entire car, the same thing we did on the understructure on this thing, just two, and I like to thin it out with acetone. I'm using this more as a sealer. We're just covering up, sealing off our bodywork, getting a good uniform coverage under everything, and then that's going to also give us, like I said, our chemical reaction to our slick sand. So now we're to the final step, as far as this video is concerned on this bodywork and on this Challenger, what we're doing, we're going to apply our Evercoat slick sand. I waited 2.5 to 3 hours for the epoxy primer to fully cure before I'm going to apply this slick sand. We're still within that chemical adhesion window of 3 days, but we want to make sure the epoxy flashes soon enough before we apply this. Failure to do so, the epoxy could come up. So in any kind of painting environment, just take your time. You don't want to rush anything. So I love spraying this slick sand. You could see how thick it goes on. I'm actually using the Vilbis GPG gun that's got a 2.5 tip. This thing, it just comes out. I mean, like I said earlier, you're spraying on filler. You could almost see how thick it is. My opinion, the thicker you can lay on this stuff, it's not going to run, the better off you are, because it'll lay flat. I see so many people complain about this slick sand, saying how it gets orange peel. It almost looks like sandpaper when you spray it. Well, you're not using enough air and too small of a tip, a fluid tip, to get it on there. So of course, when you spray it out on that small tip and these particles are so big, they're drying before they actually hit the body of the vehicle. You could see that right there. Every time I stop and walk away from the camera, that right there is 1 quart that we've sprayed on. So realistically, this car is taking the 1 coat on this whole car with this gun is 1 gallon. We went around to the second coat and that was 2 gallons on this car, to show you how much it's laying on there. When you lay it on heavy and it's really wet, it actually has time to dry on the car and lay flat. It almost acts like a self-leveling. So when you're applying this, try to take that into consideration. You could also see I'm overlapping my door edges to make sure there's even more of this slick sand on the areas that we really want to focus our gaps on. Everything else is kind of hit a little bit lighter. It's been about 15 minutes and I'm actually able to come back through with the second coat and apply the roof again. This is one of those things. Do not let this stuff dry in the gun. Clean your gun after each quart, because you're basically spraying filler. When it hardens and it kicks, it's game over for the gun. So just focus on that and let's close out this video. So wrapping up the video on the 70 Challenger with the end of the gapping, the metal work, transitioning from the frame jig to the rotisserie, and the primary first steps in the bodywork is now complete. At this point, we're gonna let the car sit about 3 weeks. Again, we put a lot of slick sand on. I mean, I say a lot. I mean, it's a fine, thin coat. You could see it around the edges. I also untaped the windows as soon as we were done priming and this slick sand flashed off. What you don't want, same thing with filler. If you put tape on it, you want to remove the tape as soon as possible while the filler's wet. When it dries, it starts trying to pull up because it's all dry together and cracks. So same thing, we didn't want anything cracking around our edges. We get that tape off initially. So that's something else you want to do. But the idea behind this, like I said, it's as much as we put on, it's going to be enough to block down. It still is thin coats, but compared to like the epoxy we put on, this is really thick, and you can see the difference when we spray it. But we'll give it about 3 weeks to shrink up. You saw on this Challenger when we started the video that when it shrinks up, it does look a lot different, and then some of the pinholes and more imperfections might be shown. What you don't want to do, and I mean it's dry to the touch right now, but what you don't want to do is you go ahead and block this whole car down, and you spend, I don't know, let's say 20 hours, 30 hours quickly blocking this whole car down, and it's perfect, and then a week later it shrinks up and then everything changes. Now you have different ratios, so everything you just done is thrown out the door. So like I said, you can't rush the bodywork phase on a quality job. There's some things you can do, like I showed in this video, to become more efficient on it, and you only do 1 step at a time. Like we did all the gapping metal work first. So we did that first, so now we shouldn't have to come back through and weld on this car, pull anything out, and just, the welding should be done. I'm not saying that there's no damage on this car. Now that it's in one color, already walking around it, there's a couple spots spots we're gonna have to address. Actually, I forgot the whole front valance on this car was original, and I hammer and dollied it out, so it still has a couple small dents in it. So I can already tell right now the slick sand's not gonna cover that. I didn't notice it till we flipped the car over and we were taping it. So there still is bodywork things that we will come back to on this car. Like I said, we don't want to rush the paint job, or the bodywork process and the paint job. This is where you get in trouble with this stuff. So just take your time, follow the TDS on these products. Like I said, we're trying to not come back and use this slick sand anymore. That was the whole point of the video. Like I said, metal work first, we transition to rotisserie, we do our rough bodywork. We shouldn't have to use Rage Ultra anymore. We should be done with that for the, well, minus the valance that I forgot about, but I'll use Rage on that. But then minus that one spot I forgot, we did the slick sand. We should come back in the next video, block out all the slick sand, and then anything that comes up should be so minor, we should just have to come through with like dolphin glaze or something. I'll show you that on the one video. We did have one spot where a bug landed in it right here, you kind of see, and I picked it out while it was still wet because I didn't want to prime the second coat over a bug. Bugs on this stuff, it's just they're so attracted to it, and it's one of the things about not painting in a paint booth with this stuff that it's just part of the game. So I picked that out and I hit this area heavy. That should block out okay. And just like I said, that's why we addressed that when we did. Everything else on it, like I said, we focused here, walking around this car, minus this one spot. The GPG gun, like I said, I think things like this, using the right tools, the right primer guns, I mean, it's an investment, but it really pays off because you looking down the side of the car doing the walk around on it, there really is minimal orange peel. I mean, you could see some cars on the side of the road and this is what their clear coat looks like. And don't forget, we sprayed 2 gallons of filler on this car, and the whole idea on this is the smoother, like I was saying earlier, you can get this to lay out, the less blocking you have to take off. If you have giant humps, well, now we have to take half the product off just to level the product itself off. So realistically, that primer gun will pay for itself after you use it a couple times, and you know, the material you've saved not blocking it off. So all in all, I'm super happy with this car. I'm very excited about it. I think it looks really good. See it in one color. Now, it did show a couple of other issues in one color. Over there, I got to address one door height is a little bit high right here. It looks like the door stamping started curving a little bit much, so we'll come back through. We might have to sand that down, hit it with a hammer a little bit. Like I said, these are things you're gonna run into the more you stare at this car for hours and hours, especially once they get in one color, the more issues you find. Same thing, when we come back on the next video, we're gonna block this whole car down for the first time. Don't forget, we only block this area and this area. Now this slick sand is gonna transition everything. So we might find something, I mean, I don't think so, because when it was wet, I'll sit there and eye down the car and you can mostly see any major issues. So saying that, we might find something small here or there we're going to have to address. We're not done on the car. We still got our 2K. We're going to have a bunch of other stuff to do on it. So stay tuned for that. Like I said, this car is going to sit for about 3 weeks. I like to be extra cautious and everything, especially the amount that we put on there. And I want to sit. We're not in a rush. The owner's not in a rush for this, and it's good, you know, to have realistic expectations. And we explained this before we start the process that, hey, you know, if you're looking for a 2-month turnaround, quick paint job, this isn't the shop. Now, I'm not making excuses for shops that have the car for 8 years and say, well, materials take time to dry, but realistically, a good quality bodywork paint job does take time. So if you're at your house, if you're doing your own project car, try not to rush it. I know it gets exciting. You see it like this, you want to come the next day and just block the whole car out, but just wait. Follow the directions, all this stuff. The bodywork in general, it's not rocket science here. Everything has clear directions that they write everything out for you, all possible scenarios and how to do this stuff. You just got to read the technical data sheets and follow the directions. And then if you have a question, that's something you can research. So hopefully this video helped you try to be more efficient on the products we're using, how not to waste stuff, and how to just, you know, not have to go back and redo other stuff. So if you like this kind of stuff, stay tuned. We're gonna start blocking this Challenger, the 73 we showed you in the beginning of the video, out, since that has been sitting for quite a while now. We're gonna do the first coat of blocking, and then we're gonna kind of work the gaps to give you a different perspective. And then, like I said, in about a month, we're gonna finish blocking this video. These videos take a little bit longer to put out with the bodywork stuff, because it's so hard to show, you know, the bodywork. It's kind of boring. You know, you can block this car for 25 hours and it could still look the same when you're done as it did when you put 2K. It's the stuff you're not seeing, that when you put the clear coat on and you look down the car and you see those waves, that's the stuff we're trying to get out. Where when we started the video and this car was all in the E-coat, it looked almost the same. So that's kind of where we are with the bodywork, and that's why I don't film a lot of the bodywork. A lot of this is time lapse. I try to put as much information in here to help you as we can, and the next video is going to be the same way. We're going to try to condense it, just sand down really quick, and just show you a bunch of time lapse stuff on what's going on, so you get the process. So again, thank you for sticking along with this video. If you like this kind of stuff, comment, subscribe to our channel. It really helps us out. And until the next time, we'll see you. I'm Rick from Carthage Classic Cars.